Good morning. The committee will now come to order. Thank you all for joining us today. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. Before we start, I want to address some housekeeping matters. First, today's open portion is being broadcast live and streamed on the committee's YouTube channel. It will be conducted entirely on an unclassified basis. All participants are reminded to refrain from discussing classified or other information protected from public disclosure. I now recognize myself for my opening statement. First off, I want to thank each and every one of these witnesses, which I'll introduce in a minute. I know them personally, and I greatly appreciate their contributions to our overall national security dialogue and their unbelievable expertise as they served in important positions. You know, when I look out, I see titles such as General, Secretary, Director of the CIA, Deputy Director of ODNI, and you look at those titles and they're impressive, but the individuals that are sitting behind those are much more impressive than the titles. You made them what they were because of your expertise and your contribution. As I discussed with each of you, we normally open with a worldwide threats hearing that includes the Director of ODNI, Director of NSA, Director of FBI, and the Director of the CIA, where they give us their guidance and their perspective as to what we should be focusing on in the upcoming year. As a committee, we had a discussion and believed that prior to that, we needed to reach out to those in the national security community who could give us an additional perspective as we begin our planning to work in concert with the intelligence community. And I greatly appreciate your willingness to do that today. Your guidance and expertise is going to be incredibly important. Now to introduce our panelists, we have General David Petraeus, who is a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, commander of the International Security Assistance Force, Afghanistan, and commander of U.S. Central Command and the surge in Iraq. He currently serves as a partner at KKR and is the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Dr. Heather Wilson is a former member of Congress and member of this committee and served as the 24th Secretary of the United States Air Force. She is currently the 11th president of the University of Texas at El Paso. General Retired Philip Breedlove is the former commander of U.S. European Command and the 17th Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which I always think is one of the coolest titles in the military, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And the Honorable Sue Gordon is the former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. She served nearly 30 years in the IC, including as the Deputy Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and in several executive positions at the CIA. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to your participation today. I know that you're all familiar with this committee and our charge, so we're going to be looking to you to help us with what you think are the most concerning threats to our national security. And is the Intelligence Committee organized and funded appropriately to address these current and future threats? And what can be done to improve cohesion among those involved in intelligence, and how can congressional oversight of this work be improved? And I also think there may be a few questions about a balloon. With that, I yield to my ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by thanking the chairman for holding these hearings and conceiving of these. I guess this is a panel rather than a hearing, but one of my complaints about the Congress is that we do a whole lot of breadth and not enough depth. And this is going to give us an opportunity to really get into the guts of the challenges around our most significant risks. I was really impressed to see that a lot of the testimony we're going to receive today deals with the complexity. A number of you have said that the threats the United States face are as complicated, as challenging, and as complex as at any point in our history. That in and of itself is interesting. I do want to, I hate the word, but I'm going to approach this a little orthogonally. And what I mean by that is that this Congress is doing plenty in terms of thinking about the military and intelligence assets that we put up against the Chinese, the Russian, the Iranian, and the North Korean threats. We're doing an awful lot. Just yesterday we had in Financial Services a hearing featuring 14 bills on how to limit the economic power of China. I hope we get those things right. What we're not thinking nearly enough about, and I'm going to beat this drum this afternoon, is what I think is one of the primary causes, or certainly aggravators, of conflicts. A conflict which, if we're talking about China or Russia, is almost inconceivable in the devastation it would wreak on the world economy, and that is the threats of mistakes, of misinterpretation, and misinformation. Anybody thinking about China, I would commend Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August to take a look at how you can get into a catastrophic, near-apocalyptic situation through mistake and misinterpretation. We don't talk a lot about this because we are generating the momentum to counter a threat. When does momentum in countering a threat begin in the eyes of our antagonist to look like aggression that might provoke an unpredictable response? So, with Russia, do we know the red lines? Do we know when Putin is inclined? What are the territorial and battlefield red lines that lead to the use of a tactical nuclear device or of a dirty bomb? Do we know how and when he becomes isolated and paranoid to a point where the rules change? With Iran, instability there today. At what point does instability become dangerous? At what point do the Iranians accelerate their attempts to get a nuclear weapon in a way that makes conflict ultimately unavoidable? With China, do we understand the red lines? Do we have the assets to understand leadership intentions? Do we understand the degree of stability inside Beijing? If the answer to any of these questions is no, it may not matter precisely where the F-35s are located, because we could find ourselves in the situation so memorably outlined by Barbara Tuchman in The Guns of August, and finding ourselves in a catastrophic position. There's a lot here. Intelligence obviously is about understanding red lines, about understanding intentions, about understanding and evaluating stability, and I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today on whether we're properly configured to avoid catastrophe that we stumble into. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. All of you have testified before Congress before, and you know, and I just wanted to point out to you, a lot of the members have other hearings that they are stepping out to. They'll be coming back. Everybody's very eager to come back and to ask you questions. With that, I wanted to thank you for submitting your written statements, because the members had an opportunity in advance to read those, so they're not missing out on the discussion, and they will be returning to participate. But with that, I wanted to begin the opening statements with General Petraeus.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Hyams, members of this very important committee, thank you for the invitation to offer brief thoughts on the threats facing the United States, the intelligence community posture to assess those threats, and this community's essential responsibilities, noting that the thoughts I provide are my own and not those of any firm or organization which I'm affiliated, and that it is a great pleasure to do so today alongside Dr. Wilson, former SACEUR Phil Breedlove, and my longtime colleague in various positions, former PDD-NI Sue Gordon. I believe that the national security threats currently facing the United States and our intelligence community are more numerous and more complex than at any point in our modern history, to include the height of the Cold War. In fact, we now face a phenomenon that is distinct from any our nation has had to manage before: simultaneous, multi-dimensional rivalries with two nuclear-armed global powers, China and Russia, each very different in its own right, but each with a major chip on its shoulder about the current world order that has the United States at its center. Even as the challenges posed by China and Russia have grown in urgency and severity, however, other threats have not receded, but instead are interacting with great power competition in consequential and often unpredictable ways. These other challenges include two increasingly capable and aggressive regional revisionist powers, North Korea and Iran, the persistence of fanatical Islamist extremist networks that, while for the moment degraded in capability, have lost none of their desire to destroy us and our way of life, a number of failed and failing states that create tinder for great power and regional rivalries, and also humanitarian crises and transnational threats that respect no borders, including pandemic diseases, organized criminal elements, human migration, and climate change. As a global power with global interests, the United States cannot ignore any of these problems, as tempting as it may be to imagine otherwise. Rather, our country is best imagined as the guy in the circus who has to keep a tent full of plates spinning at the same time. That is, to deal with numerous threats simultaneously, albeit with the indispensable help of allies and partners. The China plate clearly is far and away the biggest and most important, the pacing threat, as our national defense strategy properly identifies it. But that is not the only plate that has to be kept spinning, and if we lose control of one or more of the other plates, we should anticipate the likelihood of them crashing into several of the others. It bears emphasizing in particular that our competition with China is global and multidimensional. This means that even as we rightly increase resources for the Indo-Pacific, where the challenge is sharpest and the risk of military conflict the greatest, other parts of the planet, to include the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, are also crucial theaters for various aspects of the Sino-American rivalry that cannot be neglected. We should recognize that Beijing seeks to divide the Euro-Atlantic alliance, pull long-standing U.S. partners in the Middle East into its orbit, establish military footholds in Africa, and secure access to sensitive technologies and natural resources in multiple geographies. Needless to say, the intelligence community has to be resourced to anticipate and understand China's global ambitions and activities, not just its regional ones. For this reason, I want to recommend strongly that you seek to invest more in the most important asset in the intelligence community, its human capital. This is particularly warranted in the non-military agencies, especially the CIA, where, as Representative Spanberger knows, the tasks typically far exceed the available personnel, especially when it comes to our clandestine service officers. And thus, professional development and training and education are difficult to schedule and complete. By contrast, as Representatives Wenstrup, Stewart, Crawford, Gallagher, Crenshaw, Waltz, Kelly, Garcia, Houlihan, and Crow know from their time in uniform, the U.S. military service has the U.S. military services have the best, most fully resourced professional development systems in government, with lengthy initial entry courses and then subsequent further courses every 3 to 5 years in an individual's career, culminating in full academic years at staff and war colleges for commissioned officers and a similar course for senior non-commissioned officers. There is also a large personnel account authorized and appropriated for in the military services for those in training and education, and that account encompasses the instructors and trainers in the schoolhouses as well. There is nothing like that in the non-military intelligence agencies beyond the very impressive initial onboarding and periodic language and special skills training, and I strongly recommend examining how additional resources could be provided to enable greater investment in the exceedingly talented and committed members of the CIA in particular. Again, the intelligence community's human capital is its greatest asset, and I think that when you dig into this issue, you will agree that additional resources should be devoted to the development of it, especially in the CIA. Another area I would encourage you to examine is the overall structure of the community, seeking to identify unnecessary duplication and layering, and thus ways to achieve efficiencies and savings in personnel that can be applied to address existing shortfalls and emerging needs. I would suggest a particular examination of the substantial growth in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Having discussed the intent behind creation of ODNI and the other intelligence reforms enacted in the wake of the 9/11 attacks with members of Congress who were part of that effort, it appears that the size of ODNI has expanded considerably beyond what was envisioned. I recognize fully that ODNI performs very important missions intended to prevent the kind of disconnects and failures that precluded prevention of the 9/11 attacks. And it is important to note to this committee that much of the ODNI's growth is due to statute as well. Regardless, the very substantial number of personnel in that headquarters creates a considerable challenge for the rest of the community from which those personnel tend to be drawn, noting that there are finite numbers of personnel with the expertise, experience, and skills needed, and that it is important to get the balance right between those pulled up to headquarters and those who are actually doing the vital work of gathering intelligence and processing and analyzing it. Having worked with DNI Haynes closely in several capacities in the past and holding her in very high regard, I am confident that she would examine this issue and that of the overall IC structure with you in a very constructive manner. As an additional item in this area, and something that is a bit arcane, there likely also is a need to examine and rationalize the respective roles, responsibilities, and relationships of the national mission managers and the national intelligence officers in ODNI, as well as the coherence of the assessments they offer to the National Security Council and the National Intelligence Council, respectively. I would offer that the committee should focus as well on some of the most critical enablers, helping those in the community as they endeavor to gather, analyze, and share intelligence on the various threats I've discussed. Here I would suggest a particular focus on whether additional investments are needed in the areas of open source intelligence, tradecraft in an era of ubiquitous surveillance, and technologies to enable every aspect of intelligence work, from gathering human, imagery, signals, cyber, open source, and other forms of intelligence, to enabling the processing and analysis of that information by those performing such tasks, and doing all of this in greater partnership with the private sector where much of the expertise and capabilities reside. I believe such issues will prove to be very significant for this committee to examine and oversee, and the results of that could be very beneficial to the community and to our country. I want to bring my remarks to a close, Mr. Chairman, by applauding your intention to be bipartisan in your approach. The reality is that none of the threats we will discuss today is capable of defeating the United States, not China, not Russia, not Iran, not al-Qaeda, not ISIS. The only force that can defeat the United States is the United States itself. It is our adversaries' fondest hope that we allow the disagreements that sometimes divide us to define us. Impassioned debate is, of course, inherent to our system and society. And as each of you appreciate from personal experience, I'm sure democracy is a contact sport. Yet I do believe it important to remember that the institutions and values that unite us are stronger than our differences, and I am hopeful that this committee will set a powerful example in this respect. As I've discussed with you privately, Mr. Chairman, I was privileged to be the director of the CIA when Congressman Mike Rogers and Dutch Ruppersberger were the chairman and ranking member of the HPSCI. They embodied just such an approach, and it fostered very constructive and productive relationships with IC leaders, even as the members of the committee pursued their oversight responsibilities very vigorously. Finally, I hope that you will be able to spend time with members of the community's agencies, to meet them where they work, to see their facilities, centers of excellence, and capabilities here in the United States, and to spend time with them in our stations and operational deployments overseas as well. As I know you recognize, the community is comprised of very special Americans, and particularly when times might be challenging in our nation's capital, I am confident that visits with them will leave you with energy, enthusiasm, and inspiration, as well as deep appreciation for the extraordinarily important missions they perform around the world and the admirable way in which they seek to perform those missions. Thank you very much.
General Petraeus, thank you, and thank you for mentioning the dedication to bipartisanship. This committee actually just began its work yesterday with our organizational meeting, and the Speaker and the Minority Leader came before this committee, very unusual for them to attend our organizational meeting, and gave us the charge of changing the culture and our practice back to bipartisanship, and the ranking member and I also then made that commitment both to the committee and to both of them personally. So thank you for raising it. Dr. Heather Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask that my full statement be included for the record.
Approved.
I really just wanted to highlight 4 points and then get to people's questions. The first is that I think probably Russia's attack on the Ukraine has illustrated something very important for this committee, and that is how much intelligence collection has changed through the ubiquity of smartphones and drones and social media, and that rapid integration of massive amounts of data reliably, faster, to many more users than ever before is one of the challenges facing the intelligence community going forward. And that challenge, I'm not sure we've met yet. And thinking about what the implications are there for how we develop our intelligence officers and how we develop our systems of collection, targeting, and dissemination and analysis. Second, China is the most important strategic competitor that we face, not only militarily, but also economically and with respect to technology. As a nation, we are not educating enough people in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to meet the threat. And I don't just mean the national security threat. This is different for us. It's different from where we were in the Cold War, facing a massive nuclear power which was economically far inferior to the United States. And we have to think about it in a different way. The responsibility to do that doesn't just rest with the federal government. It includes state governments and private entities, as well as local entities that educate our children. And in Texas, even today, there is a hearing about the Texas budget that includes significant funding for research for Texas universities and a new Texas Space Commission. So the responsibility is distributed, but the challenge is nationwide. I would also say, with respect to technology, there is no agency in the intelligence community that is responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, because we really haven't had to think about scientific or technical surprise since the end of the Second World War. And I think we need to think about that. How does this committee steward an enterprise that can avoid scientific and technical surprise? Third, this committee oversees the space capabilities for the intelligence community, and the environment has changed. Our satellites are extremely vulnerable, and we are still the best in the world at space. The United States is unrivaled at space, and our adversaries know it. And they are seeking to develop the capabilities to deny us the use of space during crisis and war. In some ways, I think we built glass houses before the invention of stones. And we have to think differently and review the strategy for space that thinks about the entire architecture. So often on this committee, people will come up and talk about the iteration, the next step, the next piece of equipment to do the particular mission. This committee must look at the entire architecture and whether it can prevail during all phases of crisis and war in a way that meets the needs of the nation. That's different, and it's different because the threat has emerged over the last decade. The fourth comment that I would make before standing for questions is that this committee also has the task of balancing civil liberties with national security. This committee conducted 2 years of oversight from 2006 to 2008 that resulted in the modernization of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and those amendments. That work has generally stood the test of time, and this committee will have to consider its reauthorization this year, and that deserves to be reauthorized, particularly Section 702, that has to do with how information is gathered and accessed by the intelligence community. But there's an area that I think deserves oversight. Federal agencies defer to the FBI on counterintelligence information. Now, that's fine if that information has been tested in a court of law or questioned by outside analysts and competitively so. But often it's not. Law enforcement information can become the basis of administrative decisions that affect the lives and livelihoods of Americans with no independent review, no competitive analysis, and no process of appeal. In that area, I think the balance to protect civil liberties must be restored. And I'd be happy to expand upon that further in private session. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.